Last night, you may have noticed, you may have heard already this morning that Just Stop Oil, they're at it again. They were disrupting the BBC Proms at the Royal Albert Hall. Two protesters disrupted the opening night after running on the stage, setting off a confetti cannon and sounding air horns. The pair were taken off stage within moments of unfurling their orange banners on Friday evening. Well, we have two people to talk about this. Jane Touil is a Just Stop Oil spokesperson, and James Max, a TalkTV presenter, of course, is also a trustee of the Royal Albert Hall. And in a tweet, just before we go to them, in a tweet, Just Stop Oil said their supporters set off confetti cannons and sounded air horns, demanding the UK government immediately halt all new oil and gas consents and licences. They attempted to address the audience before being forcibly removed. The action was targeted because of the BBC's, as they call it, underwhelming coverage of the climate emergency. The BBC's underwhelming coverage of the climate emergency. Now, the BBC has said there's no disruption to the concert or the broadcast during the few seconds the protesters were on stage. Let's talk to Jane and to James. Let's start with Jane. Jane, good morning to you. Very good of you to join us this morning. A lot of people will say this is the Proms, this is a big and important event, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with the climate emergency, if indeed there is an emergency, which a lot of people say there isn't. Why was it justified, Jane?
There is an emergency, and because there's an emergency, that affects everything we know and love. Everything is under threat. We love the Proms, we love sporting and cultural events, and the reason we're disrupting them is to raise the alarm and say this is what we're in danger of losing unless we tackle the root causes of the climate crisis, which is the burning of coal, oil and gas for energy. And our government, instead of tackling it, is going in exactly the wrong direction.
This time last week, Jane, around this time last week, there was a wedding between, two fairly public people, George Osborne, the former Chancellor, and his bride, a woman called Thea Rogers. A Just Stop Oil person threw confetti over them as well, interrupting...
No, it wasn't us. Sorry to interrupt. That wasn't us. And also throwing confetti at weddings.
Do you condemn that?
Not that we condemn it. I mean, throwing confetti at weddings is a time-honoured tradition in this country.
It was a protest, though. It wasn't just throwing confetti.
To throw orange confetti. We don't actually know who that lady is, but we can confirm it was nothing to do with us.
Well, you interrupted the Proms last night, and you've talked about the BBC's underwhelming coverage of the climate emergency. Why do you believe that to be the case?
So the BBC, we think, is not giving balanced coverage to the climate emergency. So, for example, the other week they had a top oil executive on who was talking about the amount of job losses there was going to be when we move away from fossil fuels, and actually not talking about the fact that there's going to be many more good quality jobs in the green economy.
I mean, Jane, with the greatest respect, do you honestly expect us to believe that the BBC has underwhelming coverage of the climate emergency? It seems every time you turn on the BBC, you're being lectured about the climate.
They cover small atomised aspects of the climate situation, but what they don't do is join all the dots to give us the complete picture about what the apocalyptic situation we're in. It is so urgent and it is so serious. I agree with King Charles. He says we should be on a war footing. If we were on a war footing, we would have daily announcements like during COVID. The Prime Minister would give serious press conferences every day about what we're doing about this critical situation that threatens all our lives and all our cultural activities, including the Proms. And we would also have it front and centre of our national broadcasting company's coverage. And I have to say that isn't the case with the BBC. They do cover quite trivial topics.
OK, James Max, were you there last night?
I wasn't there last night, but as you might imagine, I, as a trustee at the Royal Albert Hall, I do receive quite a lot of incoming. It's quite interesting that Just Stop Oil said that they set off confetti cannons and air horns. They did neither of the two. They didn't have time to, and thankfully the security at the Royal Albert Hall was pretty clear and quick, and we dealt with the protesters effectively. I mean, I think here's the issue here. Regardless of what you view on the climate issue, the fact that the BBC should have only one view, which is that there is, one, a climate crisis, and two, that there is only one way to deal with this, isn't particularly balanced, in my view. And the second point is that if you ask Just Stop Oil, I would say there are two things. if it's that important, stand for election. We have a democratic society. Stand for it, change the laws. And as opposed to disturbing and distracting people's lives, you're turning people off. They're just not interested in what you have to say. And the more you do this, the more you're going to turn them away from your cause. It is not helpful. And when you have a look at an organisation like the Royal Albert Hall, which takes things like climate and energy use and all these things very seriously, and has some very significant changes which are being made to how we operate to make sure that we're efficient as a charity, and also that we're aware of what we're using in terms of energy or elsewhere. You're not going to get people on your side if you just start to disrupt organizations and concerts and make costs more significant because of the policing of them that we have to put in place. It makes no sense to me, even if there are any scintilla of truth in what you talk about, which a lot of people don't actually agree with.
James, what's been your reaction, and what has been the reaction of people you work with as a trustee to what happened last night?
Look, I think we all know that if you work in the event business, that there is a chance that Just Stop Oil are going to come along. We make sure that we have brief security. We take advice from the Metropolitan Police as well as to how we deal with these things. We can't stop people buying tickets if that's what they want to do, and that's exactly what Just Stop Oil did. They seem to be funded well enough to go and buy tickets and then turn up in the wrong place, break the rules and turn up where they shouldn't, and then disrupt an event. But look, you know, as an event organizer, we understand that that could very well happen, and we're acutely aware of it. I just happen to think that the way that this has been done it's kind of getting boring, and it's turning people away. If you listen to, as I have now obviously watched the footage from last night, if you listen to the crowd reaction, they're hardly supporting, and the place was packed to the rafters, and they were very pleased when the protesters were removed. Surely, if you want to get people on your side, this is not the way to do it.
Jane, you're losing people, aren't you?
Well, I'd just like to say that climate breakdown is a fact. It's not an opinion. And you can't have balanced coverage where you've got 99% of the world's climate scientists and scientists saying we are going to hell in a handcart if we don't tackle this issue.
Jane,
and then say, oh, yeah, but somebody else happens to have an opinion.
So, Jane, do you think then that people who have another view on climate and fossil fuels should be silenced and not allowed in the media? Is that your view?
No, absolutely. They have a right to their opinion, but there is a difference between opinion and fact. You can't argue with physics. The UN Secretary General just last week said that climate change is out of control.
He's not a scientist, is he?
He's basing his view on 196 countries' top climate scientists, published in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which sets out the severity of the crisis, the impacts of the crisis, and the pathways we need to be on to solve the crisis. If you'll just indulge me a moment, there's a guy called Hans Joachim Schellnhuber. He founded the Potsdam Institute, which is the world's most prestigious research institute on climate impacts. And he said, if we don't solve the climate crisis, we can forget the rest.
So in terms of
for David Attenborough, it's the end of human civilization is on the horizon.
So why don't you
This is the severity.
Jane,
it's not opinions, it's physics,
Jane,
it's fact.
Okay, I think there's a lot of people who would disagree with that, but why don't you do what James Mack says and stop these silly stunts at Wimbledon, at the Royal Albert Hall, that are actually losing you people's... I mean, the Labour Party, for example, has said that they're fed up with you. There are many other people in this country who say, you know, we've just come to watch the Proms, we've just come to watch Wimbledon, we're not interested in your climate protests. Why don't you stand for election and put your money where your mouth is?
That just illustrates that you don't get how urgent the situation is. We don't have time to stand for election. So there's this guy called Professor Sir David King. He works at Cambridge. He was the chief scientific advisor to two UK governments and the chief climate science advisor to the May and Cameron governments. And he said in 2021, we must move rapidly. What we do, I believe, in the next 3 to 4 years will determine the future of humanity. We are in a very desperate situation. We hear that all the time, Jane.
We've heard that so many times. We've heard we've got 5 years to do this. James, come in on this. What do you think?
Listen, I am absolutely flabbergasted that you think that there isn't time to have a general election, but you do think that there is time to disrupt people and turn people off your cause if that's really that important. I think part of the problem here is that you are misconstruing fact and then being able to use fact in terms of being able to extrapolate into the future. We've learned from history that if you start to extrapolate into the future, you'll find that, first of all, you'll get it wrong. And secondly, there are a lot of things that are going to take an awfully long time to change. Now, you may not like that, and that's fine. But there are a lot of people who do like the way that they live or wish to continue living in the ways that they do, and they don't support your particular protests. And it is wrong to continually protest in this way, in this disruptive way. It's not achieving your aim.
And James, sorry to interrupt you, but it is disruptive, isn't it, Jane? Because you've got your organisation, which, as far as I can work out, and correct me if I'm wrong, is overwhelmingly middle class, is blocking roads and is stopping working class people getting to work.
So we are a fire alarm. We are asking people to wake up and face the severity of the situation we're in. We don't like causing disruption, but everything else has failed.
You don't like causing disruption? Well, you do quite a lot, Jane.
We tried writing to our MPs, we've tried petitions, we've tried standard protests. You know, disruption throughout history has achieved rapid social change. That's what we need, rapid social change. We're putting statues up to suffragettes at the moment. They were reviled at the time. They're absolutely reviled for the disruptions that they caused to society, to tackle an injustice and highlight an injustice that women did not have the vote. We've got the civil rights movement in America. Martin Luther King was the most hated person in America. He was assassinated. Now we have Martin Luther King Day and we have civil rights.
I'm terribly sorry. No one from Just Stop Oil is Martin Luther King. James Max?
Look, there's a big difference between what the suffragettes did and what you're doing, in the sense that you can stand for election, they couldn't. You can vote, they cannot. We live in a parliamentary democracy. You say there isn't time, but you have all the time in the world to disrupt people, to stop people working in arguably the other bigger crisis. And the other bigger crisis, which you are exacerbating, is the fact that people are not able to afford to live. They're not able to afford to pay their mortgages. They're not able to afford to put proper food on their tables. And the reason for that is that we are making oil and energy and gas and all these things which are integral to our lives, we are making them more expensive and more difficult to get hold of. And you are making it more difficult for people to get on with their lives. Now, if you want to change their minds, that's absolutely fine. If you can show an alternative, then please do it. Stand for election, please do it, and then people can choose. But it's not down to you to tell other people how to live their lives.
Jane, there's an election next year. Even you don't think the planet won't be here next year. Why don't you stand for election? Why don't you put your money where your mouth is?
We don't have time to go through the ordinary democratic process. The cheapest form of energy is onshore wind. It's 9 times cheaper than oil and gas. The reason we've got a cost of living crisis is because we are not moving away from fossil fuels. And the reason we have to act now is because our government is licensing over 100 new fossil fuel projects, oil, gas, a new coal mine. This is genocide. I'm telling you, this is genocide because they do it in full knowledge that millions of people will die as a result of what they're doing.
And
I can't stand for that. You shouldn't stand for that. Nobody should stand for that. And it is entirely legitimate to raise the alarm because of their genocidal policies.
Jane, let James speak. James, final word to you.
It's really clear, and this is the biggest problem with Just Stop Oil. You don't listen, you don't debate, you don't care for the democratic process, and you don't get people on your side. There may be some arguments that you have that might perhaps persuade some, but not in the way that you're doing it. And if you continue these protests, you're making it more expensive for people to live their lives. And more importantly, you're getting in the way.
You don't understand the severity of the situation. You don't understand the process of how we achieve change in our society rapidly enough.
You're making assumptions, once again, not only about the future, but also about the intelligence or otherwise of people listening now. And I think the intelligence of people listening now is that they would like to be talked to properly. They don't want to have their lives disrupted in this way. It's getting tiring, it's getting boring, it's getting expensive, and it's not achieving your aims.
Thank you both very much indeed. That's James Max there, who's a TalkTV presenter and a trustee of the Royal Albert Hall, and Jane Touil, who is a Just Stop Oil spokesperson.